welcome back to the My First Rodeo podcast, the show where we ask really cool, interesting, and famous people about the various firsts on their paths to success. Today is no exception. We have Seth Miller, who runs the Innocence Project of Florida, does some great work investigating and determining which cases are meritorious, where there's been a wrongful conviction of someone generally who is on death row or serving a life imprisonment sentence or another long sentence. And after investigating it and really selecting those few cases that meet that criteria and the ones that have a path to an exoneration post-conviction, they take those cases and they pursue the various avenues that are available and not only take them through, hopefully, to exoneration, but also then work with the exonerees who they've freed to help them reintegrate into society after that tremendous wrong has been lifted. Really great work. If that sounds familiar to you and you're a regular listener of the podcast, you'll remember that on episode 8, we had Justin Brooks, who was then the director of the Innocence Project of Florida, on the show. And then many episodes later, in episode, I believe it was 32, we had Brian Banks. Brian was one of Justin's clients, and like so many of these stories, they really are compelling narratives, and they become compelling movies or books or podcasts. And Brian Banks became a Hollywood movie called Brian Banks, which I always seem to find when I'm flying on a plane as one of the movie offerings. But a great story about an exoneree for someone who was wrongfully accused of sexual assault and really lost the opportunity to play NFL football, went to prison, and then post-exoneration had an opportunity to redeem their football career in some way. So really great stories these are. Seth's been part of a lot of them that have gotten national attention for a variety of reasons, including the case of Leo Schofield. I think I call him Michael accidentally in our interview. But Leo, who was accused of killing his young wife, Michelle Schofield, and that's part of the Bone Valley story, Bone Valley podcast, where an investigative reporter decided to take on that case and ultimately attracted the lawyers to help with it, including Seth. So really some great conversations we get into there. What I love about talking to Seth, not just on the podcast, but in general, is just that he reminds me of people I grew up with. I immediately feel like I've known him a long time, even though now I've known him for a little bit of time. But when I first met him, he just had a familiarity to him. And some of it was just the Northeast, but a lot of it I really think has to do with growing up Jewish or Jewish-ish in my case. I'm not a practicing Jew, but you grow up in that culture. You grow up around the people, and you really have an opportunity to observe the best of the Jewish community and the history that emanates from, a long history that even predates the Holocaust, but certainly the Holocaust is an important part of that narrative. And it draws a lot of people into good works. Obviously, a great history of that in the civil rights movement, Jewish people standing arm to arm to help move the civil rights legislation and civil rights initiatives forward, and lawyers to go into courts, and in some cases at great expense, including losing their life. And Seth is part of that great tradition of good people who happen to be Jewish, and in part because they're Jewish, and because of that heritage that's in their DNA and that they grow up around, just being drawn to passionately advocate for those who don't have a voice. And Seth talks about his grandparents who are Holocaust survivors and spent time, including his mother, in a refugee camp post-World War II, and just how that impacted him, not so much in a conscious way at the time, but that later he was able to put it all together as part of what drew him to that work. So I think you're going to enjoy this conversation, and I will say that I need to own a technological glitch. We recorded a prior conversation that I unfortunately lost and had to do it again, but I love the conversation that we had and lost, and I love the one that we captured. This is me talking to Seth Miller of the Innocence Project of Florida. All right, we're back. Thanks for working through all the technical stuff. Appreciate it. I I gotta own something for our listeners, very sheepishly, and that is we had a wonderful conversation, as we have many wonderful conversations. But it was a special one, and it was about 2 weeks ago. And then through user error or corruption of technology, I lost that wonderful discussion. So thought about a bunch of different ways to do it, and just thought rather than pretending we were having the conversation for the first time, I would just own it here and hope that we have another beautiful conversation.
Well, Mike, the funny thing about it is that I have these moments in life where I have these wonderful experiences, right? And what do you always try to do when you have wonderful experiences? You try to recreate them.
Yeah.
And what happens when you try to recreate them? They are not as wonderful as the first time. So I really ascribe to this notion of like the moment ends. And so that just means you make new moments. So we're going to make a new moment here.
And I look forward to that. I do. You were saying something interesting
Yeah.
when we were just messing around a minute ago that has nothing to do with our conversation, but you were saying that you're on your way to a bat mitzvah, and that if I understood you right, bats and bar mitzvahs are a creation in our generation or our lifetime?
No, not bar mitzvahs. Bat mitzvahs. So for girls, because of
Gotcha.
course,
Yeah.
things have not always been as egalitarian as they are now, and in the more traditional denominations of Judaism, still not egalitarian at all.
I see.
So it just so happens that one of my oldest friends, where I grew up, I'm in Wilmington, Delaware right now. I grew up in the northern suburbs of Philadelphia. They go to the Chabad, which is like a Hasidic Jewish place of worship, community place, and they sent their kids there for preschool. So I guess instead of joining a bigger synagogue, they continue to go there, and now their daughter's celebrating her bat mitzvah. But she's not going to like read from, do the normal things you would do at a bar mitzvah, like read from the Torah. She might lead part of the service, but even in those Hasidic places of worship, they're still male driven.
I get
So
so that's kind of the deal. Get money? Do you still get money and stuff?
Yeah. No, I mean, I went out to the Walgreens today, got a mitzvah card, put a check in it, and I will hand it to the 13-year-old child of my friend.
Nice.
When I see her.
So. That's the difference of being in Delaware, Pennsylvania suburb Walgreens, in the Duval, Jacksonville, Florida Walgreens. I don't think we have a bar bat mitzvah section here.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it wasn't terribly robust,
no.
but it was there, to your point.
Very nice. Well, that was the best part of mine, was getting the gifts, I think. But apropos of our conversation, I've told you in the past, and hopefully I won't say that too many times today, but there's just something familiar about talking to you and put my finger on it recently. Not that it took brain surgery to figure it out, that it's our common upbringing, not that they were identical, but just growing up around Jewish people, not exclusively, but enough of them, and enough of that tradition and the Jewish DNA was passed along, that when I first met you, it just felt like I knew you forever.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's so interesting because I live in Tallahassee, Florida. You live in Jacksonville, Florida, and obviously Tallahassee is a very small Jewish community. Jacksonville, I think, probably bigger, but still small relative to where I grew up in Philadelphia or in New York or central North Jersey or these other places where there's a lot of Jewish folks. I mean, when I grew up, I came off of, when I came into existence, you still had a whole generation of Holocaust survivors, living life, as middle-aged people. They're my grandparents friends, in a really robust, really vibrant Jewish community outside of Philadelphia. And so, it's one of those things that whether you're meeting people through youth group who lived in Baltimore or lived in New York or lived in Atlanta, you're having these shared experiences because, the diaspora is wherever they were. Right.
Yeah.
And
it is interesting. Yeah. Cause I mean, being Jewish, generally speaking. Doesn't mean you look a certain way, or you know, everybody's got their individual culture. You are a Eagles fan. I am a Washington Commanders fan, and you know all that stuff is different. Um, but yeah, there's just something about when you find out that somebody else is Jewish, even though I'm not a practicing Jew. You are. Again, just a familiarity.
Well, they call it like Jewish geography. Whenever I meet people um, anywhere in the country who are Jewish, like I invariably know someone, from the area where they grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And, you start talking about it, and it doesn't take very long to, do a couple of degrees of separation and realize that you know some of the same people. And it's sort of crazy. I mean, when you think about it, but when you have, you have, I think, the largest Jewish population in the world in the United States, but still a tiny percentage of the population. You can find those connections no matter where people are, and it's just, I don't know how it happens, but it just does.
Yeah, and then not just people you know or people you have in common from a familial or relational standpoint, but a certain type of person. And let's talk about that as it relates to you evolving to be the person you are and do the work that you do. Tell us about your upbringing and how it connects, if it does, to the work that you do.
Yeah, and so I mean, just to lay it out, I mean, I'm the director of the Innocence Project of Florida, so mostly a nonprofit manager now, but of an organization that finds individuals who have claims of wrongful conviction in prison and proves them wrongfully convicted, and frees them many times after decades of wrongful incarceration, and reconnects them with their family into free society. And so, um, I don't know that even in the beginning of doing that work, that I had a strong understanding of how like my upbringing connected to it. But I was doing a talk at Penn State, where I went to college, and so this is many years after I graduated college. But I was invited back. They have like a distinguished speaker series, and I was invited back, and it was doing this lunchtime talk in front of like 200 or 300 people. And some person came up to me afterwards, and we were just talking, and I made a comment like, I don't have. I grew up like in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I had a house, a yard, like plenty of kids playing. My house backed up to a school. It was very, very safe. I said to him something to the effect of, I haven't experienced injustice, and I've led had a pretty simple, safe upbringing. And he looked at me and he said, you told us that your grandparents are Holocaust survivors,
Mm-hmm.
and that your mom was born in a refugee camp in Germany. And he's like, that is your, entry point into this work, that you have this sort of, it's in your genetics, it's in your generational understanding of what it means to be, disfavored, displaced, ripped from society, wrongfully imprisoned, wrongfully executed for many of my family members, and that no matter how much you don't want to think, because you didn't yourself experience it, that it's not part of your lived experience, it's in you. And he posited that perhaps your attraction to the work you're now doing is a response to that.
Mm.
And I was like, man, you're a lot smarter than I am, because I hadn't, that connection was not apparent to me. But it seems like really apparent to me now. And it makes all the sense in the world that, here I was, and I grew up outside of Philadelphia, surrounded, as I said, by, middle-aged Holocaust survivors who were my grandparents and their friends. As their friends died, they were buried in the Holocaust survivors section of the cemetery. Hearing, seeing the numbers on the arms, hearing the stories of just an insane treatment, and yet a kind of resilience and perseverance to overcome that is very much connected to the experience of my clients.
Right.
Right. And so, in a strange twist, here I am doing work that's very much connected to this thing that happened to my family and to many other Jewish and non-Jewish families, living in Europe at the time during World War II. It's just a different degree, right? And so, and it's run through my experience because I've had opportunities to have, when my grandparents were still living, my grandmother was still living, she got to meet a number of my clients, and she was a woman who didn't speak very good English, very thick accent, probably hadn't spent much time interacting in her whole life with Black people, and yet watching her and one of my clients, James Bain, who himself spent 35 years in prison for rape he didn't commit, just talk about a shared experience that happened, 30, 40 years apart, 50 years apart, and I don't know. I mean, it's whether it's serendipitous or the life works in strange ways, but it just felt like a very full circle moment for me.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, and you didn't have the experiences of your grandmother or your mother or your client, but you're sort of the conduit for just continuing that awareness and that fight, and really an appreciation that gives you, that's where empathy comes from, right? Is some sort of a shared lived experience or shared sensitivity.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, just obviously you don't have to experience anything to feel everything to feel from other people's experiences. That's precisely what empathy is, just being able to put yourself in other people's shoes and try to see things and understand things from their perspective so that you can learn and grow and become a better person yourself, and relate to the world in a more full way. And so, yeah. And so it's like, I've helped, I've been part of teams of people who've helped free 34 individuals who have spent 772 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. And I have not spent 1 second of time in prison, but every one of those individuals has taught me something about, what it means to, be put in this terrible ordeal, to be victim of miscarriage of justice, but to, figure out how to come out the other side of that. Not without help, obviously. Organizations like mine, we do this work, but
Right.
But the person has to, just as my grandmother did, decide, I'm not going down like this.
Right.
I'm going to adjust to this new situation, and I'm going to choose to be as strong as I can and figure out how to manage my way through it. And some people unfortunately weren't able to do it due to no fault of their own. But my grandparents, lucky enough to have made it to the end of the war, where they were liberated from camps, and got to get out from that, meet each other, and start a family, something that was not intended for them, but
Yeah.
ended up in their future.
And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, there's similarities and differences between the two experiences, but obviously, to understate it horribly, mistreatment in both instances. The thing of the Jewish experience, and hopefully it carries beyond that to anyone who listens or knows Jewish people. But when you grow up with it, and you grow up with it more directly than I did. I didn't have Holocaust survivors in my family, but you go to weekend Hebrew school, and it was not uncommon to have someone come in and speak about the experience, a survivor. Visiting the Holocaust Museum growing up in D.C. was just something you did, and so forth. And even my parents. I mean, whenever a special came on about the Holocaust, my dad was drawn to it. And so, that experience and the never again and the whole aspect of it is really ingrained in anybody who's, has a family member who's Jewish, I think. I don't know, everybody I know. And obviously, an exoneree doesn't have that experience. I mean, there's systemic racism, you might say. There's distrust or tension between law enforcement and certain communities from which a lot but not all of your exonerees come from. Yeah, so they don't really have, at least initially, the community. But part of what you create through the Innocence Project is a community and an opportunity for them to have a shared experience, not just of being incarcerated, but being wrongfully incarcerated and then being exonerated.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you kind of hit it on the head. It's like when in the year when the people emigrated to the United States after they were freed from concentration camps and just found communities all over the United States where they could settle. They connected with people who had that shared experience. Like my grandmother, her friends were all Holocaust survivors, right? And I think it's out of injustice, out of a terrible tragedy, you connect with people who best understand what you went through. And we work really hard at the Innocence Project of Florida to try to create spaces for our clients to connect with each other. I think about um, one of my clients, former clients, Amanda Brumfield, and she was the second wrongfully convicted woman who got out of prison in 2020, and she got out right in beginning of September 2020, in the height of COVID. And she's from Arkansas, and her husband came and kind of whisked her away, and they went straight to Arkansas. And so, she's really doing well there. She's like doing really well in the air conditioning business she works at, busy, has a house, people she's connected with there. But the thing that I think is missing is a connection into people who understand what she went through. Like, people can intellectually understand that, like, what happened to her, but they can't understand how it like impacts her on a daily basis, or impacts someone who's wrongfully convicted, incarcerated, now free. And I think the proximity, or the lack of proximity, to us here in Florida and the freed wrongfully convicted person community here in Florida is something that she and others who are kind of displaced or out away from their wrongfully convicted brothers and sisters, that they struggle with, because people can love you, but it doesn't mean they understand what you went through.
Yeah, and sometimes yeah. Oh no, go ahead.
No, so it's just hard in that respect. So we've tried to really create as many opportunities for the over 50 individuals that we're working with, both our clients and clients of our colleagues who have since moved to Florida after exoneration, to connect as much as possible and create a community of support for themselves. Creating opportunities for them to tell their stories and do public speaking and be advocates for awareness of wrongful convictions. Because again, I can go out and talk to people about these issues, but there's no better people to talk about it than the people who lived it, to the extent they're comfortable doing it. And so trying to create platforms to lift up their voices, to be the sort of tip of the spear on this issue, which it's so many of the individuals who we freed want to be, because they're like, people fought for me for however long, sometimes 10 or more years, did it all for free. So many people put so much, and the least I can do is go out and try to advocate for the next people who are still in.
Right. And
some of whom I might know.
And it becomes not their only identity, but a big part of their identity. I'm assuming there's overlap, but not complete identity, a similar identity in just people who are released from prison generally. They've gone to prison, they did the crime or were convicted for it and were not exonerated, perhaps should have been convicted. But they get out and there's a recovery from that, just like there's a recovery from anyone who gets out of prison. But it's objectively different for an exoneree, isn't it?
Yeah, and you make a good point. I mean, you don't want to diminish the prison experience, which is difficult for anyone who's experiencing it, irrespective of guilt or innocence. I think there's something additional about wrongful incarceration that exacerbates things, because you're now in a place where you don't belong, where you're being particularly if if you've committed murder or perhaps a sex crime, you're not committed, you're accused of committing, wrongfully convicted of it. You're now in a place where you've been painted as a monster, and you're treated in a way that just is completely at odds with what your identity and the truth to be.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that other people who are guilty should be treated that way, because we should treat everyone who's in prison for the for the human that they are, right? And have it be a humane place where people can both serve their time, but grow and be rehabilitated. But it's acutely difficult for an individual who did not commit the crime, knows they didn't commit the crime, to like get their head around to, now I'm institutionalized and being treated as this monster, and yet I'm not this monster, and no one believes me.
Right.
That's hard.
Yeah, that is different. Do you find, and I've never asked you this before, do you find that, I mean, everyone's different. I mean, you've had dozens and dozens of exonerees, and met many, many more across the country and the world. And so they're all different. And some of them had prior prison or jail experiences, and some of them just, whatever, woke up one day and somebody they loved had been murdered, and they find themselves for the first time having some interaction with the justice system in a really, really bad and powerful way. And maybe that's a distinction without a difference. In this case, do you find that some come out with a different appreciation for those who are having the prison experience, that are not that are not innocent, than others? In other words, do some come out and they're like, the prison system is horrible, prison system needs reform, and perhaps they go to work or have a passion for helping people, get out of prison, find opportunities without regard to guilt or innocence? And then do others maybe have a completely different impression because they're there every day with people who, for lack of a better word, mostly a lot of them did it, and maybe they're in and out of prison. How do you find that on the continuum?
I think it's not one thing, which makes sense, right? Because prison's a community of diverse people with diverse personalities, much like any other community. And so I would say that all of the folks who we have freed, I think, created relationships and friendships among people in prison, both with people who, they believe are also wrongfully convicted, but other people who committed crimes, but were just, they're trying to do their time in the most positive way possible. I think like a lot of our clients find outlets in prison, to the extent they exist, through music or programs where they meet people who are of similar mind to like stay busy and stay focused and stay positive. But our clients also tell us they're like crazy people in prison, and I use crazy not in a clinical sense, but just like come in, there's gangs and people who are not interested in trying to make the situation that they now find themselves in as positive as possible, so it's tolerable, right? But right, that's life. I mean, everywhere we look, like that's you have the full spectrum of people interacting with the world in whatever way they are, and so in prison is no different. The only difference is that it's incredibly onerous and there's not a lot to do, which breeds like resentment and restlessness, which causes all kinds of problems. It's the food stinks, the medical and the medical and dental and psychological services are substandard. If you want anything that's remotely tasty, you have to purchase it at like 10 times the cost from the canteen, and even that food is not healthy. You can't like get cards from your family anymore. Like they scan them and you get them on a screen, so you can't have like pictures to put on your wall in your cell anymore. And so I think like the existence itself is extremely difficult, and not at all what most people would tolerate in any situation in the outside world. I think there's this feeling that like it's like club fed, or whatever they would say in there, and it's not like that at all. It's sterile and nasty and just like, not a great place. No, I don't know about any people who sign up to
No,
go to prison.
and compounded, of course, when you're there and you
Yeah.
didn't do something. So going back to your upbringing, and obviously there's different ways to sort of incorporate into your existence the things that your family and generations before experienced. I believe some of it can just be passed down literally through DNA. At least, I've read some articles along those lines, and it resonates with me. But then there's communication, and so how much did your grandparents and others in your family talk about their experience in a way that impacted you?
So my grandmother, who was in concentration camp, talked about it a lot. Her husband, my grandfather, he died when I was 12. So where my grandmother died in 2015 when I was 36. So, I had a lot more time with her. My grandfather hardly talked. And so, I didn't have, unfortunately, I didn't have a great opportunity to learn all about his life because he wasn't a comfortable English speaker and didn't like to talk about his experiences. Like our relationship was, sitting in front of the TV together watching boxing, and then he died and he was gone. And so, but my parents. It's interesting enough. Like my parents are not people who are activists. Though my dad was an accountant, my mother was a school teacher. Though she was involved in the teachers union and was a union president at one point. And so there was this sort of like streak that would run through our family where like they would go on strike, and like, why is mom not working? Well, because they're trying to negotiate a fair contract and to get paid more money and get better terms. And so they're not working and so to understand kind of that type of advocacy, like my mother took me, to some marches in Washington, D.C. We took a train down from Philadelphia, one dealing with like, urging the Soviet Union to allow Jews to leave the Soviet Union, to come to emigrate to the United States of America so they could have, freedom to worship, just freedom generally. This is in the 80s before the fall of the Soviet Union. So like, at the time I didn't really think much of those things, right? It's just my existence. But it does strike me that now that perhaps those experiences push me in a direction of understanding that, when you see people who are experiencing injustice, you need to do something about it. And that paralysis or doing nothing in the face of injustice is complicity. Right. And so, I of course I didn't understand this when I was a kid, but perhaps with a few more years behind me now as a middle-aged adult, it makes a lot more sense. It connects a lot better.
Yeah, and at the very least, and it's probably more than that, it wasn't a foreign concept for you when, as we all do, you start getting older and obviously sometime probably before law school, but certainly at law school, you start trying on for size different things, tax lawyer, that doesn't seem to fit, immigration lawyer, maybe, and then you're like, you look at certain things, you look at what people are doing, the way they conduct themselves. And was that your experience? You sort of started to see examples or hear about areas of the law or areas where you could serve and you were drawn there?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And it goes back even a little bit for just a little bit farther in the past than that, because when I was in college at Penn State, I mean, Penn State is like a very lily white campus. And we had a lot of, racial discrimination issues and really safety issues related to Black leaders on campus when I was in college, and an administration that didn't really were not responsive to those things. And there was a huge organized movement, a protest movement that took over like the administration building and then eventually the student union. And it was my first kind of like window into Black civil rights organizing, essentially, but in the modern sense. And it was like thought out in the most granular way and organized, and the messages were clear and it made total sense to me. And yet people who I was friends with, other, white guys mostly who I was friends with, they heard it differently.
Mm.
And their responses, like, what are these people complaining about?
Mm.
And it was like, I'm sort of embarrassed to admit my naivete, because like these are people that I lived with, I was friends with them, but like we're watching the same thing, hearing the same thing, and I am like naturally inclined towards the folks who are, sort of having the power of things put on them or not being protected, right? And the other folks are like, what are they complaining about?
Mm.
What's their problem?
Mm.
They only got into this school because of affirmative action, that kind of stuff.
Wow.
And it was like, oh crap! Like all my friends are a bunch of racists, and it was a clarifying moment for me. So I like get to law school, and I did really well in school, and now I'm interviewing at law firms, and like just to do law firm work, all which is important and necessary. And yet, like I was interviewing with a firm, and the very nice female partner like leans across the table and puts her hand on my arm and says, "Now, Seth, what do you really want to do?" and it was both a horrific moment, because I was like, she, I'm not getting this job, but she also kind of saw maybe through me, right? That I maybe perhaps cosplaying someone who wanted to have that type of job when I really didn't want to have that type of job. Perhaps I'd want to have the money that comes along with it, because, make life a little bit easier perhaps, but that perhaps I need to do something different. And that was another clarifying moment for me. And that really just culminated with, or happened at the same time with Barry Scheck, who's founder of the Innocence Project, coming down and giving a talk that launched our Innocence organization in Florida that I now run. And I'm like, hey, I'm not figuring out how to get these law firm jobs. They're seeing right through me that maybe perhaps I'm not as interested as I should be, but there's this other thing that really interests me. They really need help. They really need people to work on these cases. And I think I want to step in the breach and get involved with that. And that's kind of, was the pivot point for me.
Yeah. And that really is a beautiful tradition that I don't know everybody knows. Wouldn't take too much to find out. Watch a good movie about the civil rights movement. There's always, Jewish people there fighting side by side, maybe not in the same quantities of people. But, obviously some of the tragedies of the civil rights movement include, civil rights activists, including Jewish people being murdered in the Deep South.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I think within the Jewish tradition, there is a strong inclination towards social activism, social justice. It's just part of Jewish education of children, commitment to connection to your community, and particularly the most vulnerable parts of your community. And it starts from a very young age. So I think there are denominations of Christianity, I think with the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and I suspect many others,
sure.
Who also have those traditions as well. And so what you see is faith traditions that are committed to, social justice, activism, standing right in the breach with folks in other traditional civil rights movements so even though they themselves might not have been impacted on a daily basis by laws or norms and practices that are putting upon certain classes of individuals, it's, you see injustice, you have to stand with people, because we as Jews, we know better, we know just as well as anyone else, the whole poem, they came for the trade unionists and I said nothing, right? And I came for such and such and I said nothing, and then they came for me, right? And so
Right.
you as people, we've lived that. Our grandparents, our parents, we have lived that, and so you can't stand quiet. You have to stand in the breach with people, particularly if you have a platform to be able to raise their voices. You got to stand up for people and stand with them.
Do you think, and I know you have a young son, that he's able to, I mean, are you deliberate about what you expose him to and what you do and obviously the traditions, or is it just impossible for him to miss anyway because it is what you do for a living? And, I'm sure you talk about cases that to the extent you can around the dinner table.
The answer is yes and yes. We don't actually hide. So I'm married to a law librarian. So there's a lawyer and a librarian. We have a 12-year-old son. His name is Gideon. So you have a sense we've imbued in him a sense of justice by giving him not only a biblical name of a judge in the Old Testament, but also the namesake of the United States Supreme Court case, Gideon Wainwright from 1963, which allowed poor folks the right to a lawyer in all criminal cases, right? And
that's a lot. It's more of a name to live into than Seth, to be honest.
Yeah, I was just the forgotten brother of Cain and Abel, and so, but yeah, no, I think that's right. But for us, it's like it's just the way things are. He's grown up at our house with people who have spent decades in prison coming over for dinner,
right?
And trying to, you can look at that person and say, well, I don't want someone who, whether they did a crime or not, who's been in prison for many years, someone who was accused as a rapist, whatever, someone who has a prior criminal record, maybe, even though they were innocent of this other thing, right?
Or just has seen the things that they've seen.
Yeah. I don't want them at my table. I don't want them influencing my kids. Maybe they're dangerous. I don't know, right? But
sure.
Another way to look at it is they're just people who, and perhaps we can learn from their experiences and help, particularly for a child who's forming as a human being, help shape their life and shape the trajectory of their life in certain ways. And so, he's just grown up where that's like normal, right? There's no question. And so, he has all, goes to school, has friends, all those things. And it's just a different experience, and it's just part of our daily existence.
Yeah. You must have some amazing conversations, and he must have just some interesting and beautiful questions that only kids can ask, including when he was younger and now that he evolves into being a young man.
Yeah, no, I think so. And the main thing is just we want him to understand that people find themselves in compromised situations. It doesn't mean that someone isn't bad because they've done a bad thing, or isn't bad because of the worst thing that they've done. I mean, people are complex, and people can be redeemed. And in many of most of my clients' cases, they didn't even do the thing. And so it just teaches you about, holding judgment, trying to see the humanity in people, but also being skeptical of power and skeptical of systems, and, being willing to constantly ask questions. And search for answers and search for truth. And so trying to imbue, give him a sense of right and wrong, a sense of justice and injustice, so he can identify those things and when he sees them and act accordingly.
Yeah, what a gift that is, and can't wait to see what he becomes with that amazing exposure.
It's funny. He went when we're recording this. I know you're not supposed to talk about you timestamp things in podcasts so they come out later, but yesterday was take your child to work day. So he went to he came to our office last year, but this year I sent him to my wife's office at the law school, and they had a whole program for all the kids, and he got to do an oral argument. And my wife said he did very well. He represented an individual who had their First Amendment rights violated, and he was vociferous and unrelenting in his advocacy for for the most expansive view of folks' right to free expression, free speech. And so I don't know that he wants to be a lawyer, and I would maybe encourage him to do something different. But as long as he has has those moral compass and has those guiding principles kind of baked in, I think he'll be okay.
Yeah, maybe history will reverse itself or repeat as the case may be. Because I'm by day a corporate lawyer, and as you know, my son Anthony, who had the privilege of being in your class and is doing quite well at Florida State, for lack of a better word, wants to do what you do. He wants to do good work for good people that have can't afford lawyers and need to have some wrong righted. So maybe maybe your son will wind up being a corporate lawyer.
Maybe, and then it just, and whatever he does, just all these kids, right? They just have to not cut corners and do the best they can for the people they're serving and whoever it is, and that's all we can ask of them.
So. Yeah, it's interesting because I've always suppressed sort of my do-gooder DNA. I tried to do good things along the way, and as you know, we met initially through a common friend who was a mentor of mine in law school, who ran until recently the California Innocence Project, Justin Brooks, on another episode of this fine podcast. And he was always calling out, or at least identified in me, a desire to do that type of work, or at least appreciate it and be an ambassador of it. So it's really a neat full circle moment that after 33 years of practicing law, I have the opportunity to serve on your board and see the good work that you're doing.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, right? Is that we serve in all different ways. And I think, like when I think about Justin, he, from a very young age, was like, I got to stand in the breach. And I think that probably had to do with his upbringing and, his, that kind of set his disposition for how he went about his life. But, people find their way into the things that are most important to them at whatever pace that they do. Right. And so I think when I think about you and I think about, all the work you do, charitable work with your, free to run event and serving on boards, whether it's mine or others, like, you figure out how you can best serve. And it could be, doing the direct services work. It could be being on boards, supporting people who do the direct services work. And we need all of those people, every last bit of them. And so, we couldn't do it without you and people like you.
Well, that's fair of you to say. I appreciate it. So what do you remember, about sort of your first Innocence case, your first exoneration, your first taste of that, the whole thing? I mean, walking into prison for the first time and sitting down with someone and trying to understand their story, deciding whether their case is worthy. That's got to be overwhelming in the beginning and then probably every time since.
Yeah, I mean, I think initially when I was a student, we had hundreds of cases we were reviewing and a deadline to file in the law at the time has since been removed. So we're in this sort of crisis moment and having to move very quickly. And but of like those first 40 cases that me and other students together worked on, like 7 of those individuals got exonerated. And the 2 main cases that I worked on, one of them, we were only doing DNA cases at the time and cases where we could test some evidence with DNA testing and prove their innocence. And one of those clients, Jules Latemps, we thought that all the evidence, all was destroyed routinely after 5 years after the sentencing. And so we kind of like passed on the case and went on to this other case, this guy, Luis Diaz, who was convicted in Miami as the Bird Road rapist and serial rapist. And they tried all these cases together, and it turned out that some of them had rape kits still available. And we were able to show through testing that not only did the same person commit the crimes, in the separate available rape kits, but that it wasn't Luis Diaz. And so, I had left, I graduated law school back when I was up in DC and got a call in 2005 that, the DNA proved him innocent. He's getting exonerated. And so that was like right away as my first sort of I'm like a 1 year out of law school. And already I'm like, wow, like I worked on that case. I wrote the motion, found the evidence, and there he was. So it kind of just demonstrated like, I can have a real impact here just by doing the work, just by like investigating, writing, litigating, being committed, doing the work. And then, when I came back to the project in 2006 as a lawyer, it's like, now I'm the person who's going into prisons, taking on the clients and building our, now a tradition of doing all of our own litigation here in house. And I think, my approach and our approach of our lawyers has always been, and our investigators has always been, we go see clients, it's just to listen to them. I think, to a person, all of our clients are, they're wrongfully convicted, and part of their story is, look, like no one's listened to me. I've been saying these things, and everyone's been finding reasons to not believe me,
Right.
whether it's the system, my lawyer, my family, whoever. And listening and demonstrating, assuming that there's evidence to prove it, demonstrating a sort of belief in the person that they're not crazy, that they're telling the truth, and we can prove it through evidence. You might be the first person that's ever done that for them.
Right.
And I think that, so it just came sort of natural to me in the sense that, like, look, this person, they're an individual, they're a person, they have their own experience, and I need to listen to that because they are the expert in their case, and I can read all the documents, but they've lived this, and I need to honor that, so I can best represent them. And I think that's, a real, it's like a hallmark of representing people in these terrible situations. It's like, it could be injured people in tort work. But, you have a person who's now entrusted you with their life, and, they have to be part of the decisions. They have to be part of the effort to get them out. And you have to listen and make them feel like you're on their side. You need to be on their side, because for so many of our clients, they're like, yeah, like I've never had anyone who has believed me and believed that I was innocent. And that's part of the reason I was wrongfully convicted.
Right.
So we really try to, it doesn't mean we're not still skeptical. We still have to like investigate cases. Once we get to the point where like, we're going to take this case because we have the goods,
Right.
Demonstrating that belief in that person goes a long way to creating the strong relationship that we need to represent them in the best way possible.
Yeah, it's sort of the first victory for them. And of course, not everybody you represent gets exonerated. And the ones that do, it's hardly an immediate process. So, I mean, you have that meeting, you tell them you're taking their case. That's a huge moment. And then sometimes, you're living with them for the next, year, 2, 3, 4, 10 years, which involves meeting and then, frankly, leaving and going home to your family and leaving them in a prison cell while you continue to work on their case. But still, patience, patience, patience.
Yeah, for sure. And, it is different than a lot of other, even other criminal defense work. Because if you're a public defender, you're meeting people on the front end of processes. You're just trying in every case, just put them in the best position possible at the end of the day. And that could be going to trial. It could be, resolving the case in a plea, and you might have frequent flyers who come through the system more often than not, but it's different in our work because we hopefully don't take too long, but sometimes it's usually at least a year or 2 or 3, sometimes 6 or 10 or longer. And you create relationships with those individuals. You create relationships with their family members. You're there when they find out that we were not able to succeed for them as quickly as possible, and their mother died, right? We're there when we have to tell them that we lost their case and there's no more avenues for relief. And they say to you, or say to me, like, our lawyers, does this mean I'm going to die here? And we talk a lot about the successes. We don't talk nearly enough about the failures. the failures of the system to take cognizance of um, someone's innocence, and the willingness of the system to leave them there, even though there's strong evidence to demonstrate their conviction should be overturned. And so, that kind of stuff sticks to you too, and it never goes away because of those relationships you build with that person. Because it's like you have their life, particularly the ones who are they're in a life sentence, their life in their hands, and their life in your hands, and it's like a big responsibility, one of the biggest responsibilities. And when you don't succeed, it often means that person's going to die in prison, unless there's some miracle, and it's tough to swallow.
Yeah, I can't imagine. And obviously, sometimes failures before successes. I'm thinking about, in a lot of these cases, bring a lot of attention to the work that you do and the work that others do around the country. But the Bone Valley case and Michael Schofield, where I know you were actively involved in that case, and at moments where it seemed like you were poised to have a success, didn't always happen.
Yeah, I mean, I've it's Leo Schofield, and no,
That's
it's
right.
okay.
It was Michelle. Michelle was his wife.
Yeah, Michelle was his wife. That's
Thank
right.
you.
And so, who was murdered, and like I worked on that case with a great team of people, since 2007 probably, and I mean we had a fingerprint evidence in the victim's abandoned car next to her blood, that pointed to a first degree murderer who was in prison, who later confessed to the crime. And Leo Scofield's conviction twice was not overturned.
Right.
And he's out now on parole. We were able to get him out, and thankfully, we would pursue any avenue to free someone from wrongful incarceration. But it is not lost on me that we were not able to succeed in the case where a first degree murderer's fingerprints are at the scene of the crime, and he has now confessed to the crime. He accused the prosecutors, now deceased, of knowing that he committed the crime, but telling him that he needed to stick to his story, that wrongfully explained his fingerprints being in the car, and yet we can't get relief.
Mm.
He had a podcast that millions and millions and billions of people have listened to and believe he's innocent, and the courts have not done anything with it. So all that's to say is, I think people sometimes think, well, if you have the evidence, it must be easy to get them out. It's overturning a murder conviction, particularly, is like moving a mountain.
Right.
Like moving a mountain, it's very difficult.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that obviously is that the system, in the Schofield case is a great example of it, often looks for reasons to justify the conviction rather than reasons to overturn it.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I mean, what I always say is that the rules and the laws that govern the stage and the process that we work, the post-conviction stage, and I tell my students, I told this to your son in my class, is that they're meant not to find truth or identify injustice or overturn wrongful convictions. They're designed to preserve convictions, even wrongful ones. That's kind of the default position. And so when a conviction gets overturned, it's not because of the system, it's in spite of it. And only because outside agitators, disruptors, folks in my office or other folks working in this area, force the system to do what it is not inclined to do in most instances. And so, and what that means is that we have over 3,300 known exonerations in the United States since 1989, which is a very large number, but it really is only scratching the surface.
Right.
That many more people in prison remain there wrongfully convicted. Many people have died in prison, wrongfully convicted before anyone could prove that they were innocent. And so it's that way because we've designed a set of rules that venerate or elevate this idea of like, oh, once you get to a certain part in the process, finality matters more than truth. And it seems to me that if you ask anyone on the street, they'd be like, how does that make sense?
Yeah.
If we know someone's innocent, why would you worry about procedural niceties? We should be doing everything we can to get them out. And yet that's not the way it works.
No, it really isn't. Well, I mean, thank you for being that outside agitator, and thanks for the opportunity to be an ambassador for the great work that you do, and teach me along the way. I couldn't be more proud to support the Innocence Project of Florida, and to support you in the good work that you do.
I appreciate the time, Mike, being here. And I want to say this was as good of a conversation as the last one we had. So we didn't try to recreate the moment, and that's why we had another great one.
I agree. That other one will just be a memory that you and I can share forever.
Yeah. Yep. So thanks for having me, Mike.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you. Well, there you have it. That's me talking to Seth Miller, the head of the Innocence Project of Florida. And if you don't know what Mensch is, look it up. There should be a picture of Seth Miller next to it. He does such good work, and he does it in a humble way. And he's found a way to, promote the good work and the results, and even himself where need be. But that's not his natural inclination. It's just to do the good work for people that don't have a voice, and to hire people that do the same, and create that spirit. And there are beautiful people all over the world doing beautiful works, many in the innocent space, many in other spaces. It's such a beautiful tradition. It's such a important part of who we should be as human beings, as Americans, but not just as Americans. And, in all this time of divisiveness and talk of divisiveness, let's remember the people that are doing that great work. Let's remember the Innocence Project of Florida. Let's remember their clients, the ones who have been exonerated, and the ones who hopefully one day will be, and the ones where the effort has been made and they did not get that result. If you have the ability, do go online, learn more about the Innocence Project of Florida, the projects and the events that they do, where you have opportunity to donate. And of course, you always have an opportunity to donate. Your money goes a long, long, long way. It's not it's not some of the more popular things to donate to, but what could be more important? I would encourage you to find some room with the money that you donate and the philanthropic efforts that you make, and at least in the awareness building that you do, to talk up the good works of the Innocence Project of Florida, the Innocence Projects of other states, and the Innocence work generally. And remember that good work that they do, and Seth Miller, and do what you can. That's all you can do. Do what you can, and certainly appreciate your listening. I hope just by listening, it's one of those things, I found that with like human trafficking. Once you learn more about it, you can't help but be compelled to do something and to share that story with others. I hope you come away from this episode with that impression. I hope you'll share this episode with others. I hope you'll subscribe, and I hope you'll come back and join us next time on the My First Rodeo podcast.
My First Rodeo.